right, so here we are at the final installment of our Blue Note album cover design mini-series. If this is the first video that you're checking out in this series, I highly recommend that you go back and look at the first two pieces we've already put out because there's a little bit of setup and context involved here, and I kind of walk through all of the elements and styling that we're using to ultimately get us to this point. Now, the first thing to talk about, and ultimately the primary reason why I chose this piece, is the grid. As we've already discussed in this series, there are dozens of ways that we could chop up these album covers and approach their various layouts and setups. But what I ultimately ended up doing for this particular setup was this. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that we don't have a vertical grid line for every major variation in the design. So for example, you might expect to see something here on the N, maybe on the T, maybe the M here. And at first, I was thinking of doing something like that, but remember from our original setup that these album covers are completely responsive all the way down to our smallest screen size. So I knew that I wasn't going to have to mess around with repositioning these elements or anything like that. And because of that, it kind of changed the approach to how I looked at the original reference image here. So what I ended up deciding to do was really focus on more the horizontal lines of the piece and getting that spacing all right. And then since we're using relative sizing on everything, I knew that I could use an M value to push these bits of text away from the edge and get them proportionally spaced just the way I wanted to in the final design. So that's why ultimately for our columns here, we've really only got three values that we're working with. We have our 1.3 M's here for this little bit of a gutter to push everything away from the edge. And then these two FR values that I'm using to get a proportional relationship between these two columns. Now, a trick that I haven't really shared with how I get some of these relationships sometime is that really for the most part, it's kind of an eyeball thing, at least for me, and at least for this particular exercise, where I'm just kind of exploring the forms and seeing where I end up. So what I often do in a situation like that is I have an app that I use a lot called ScreenFloat that effectively allows me to take a floating reference snapshot of anything on my desktop. Now, I can't use it right now, unfortunately, because it kind of interferes with the recording process. But basically what I do with that app is I'll take a little screenshot of this cover, and then I can take that floating version back into the builder, and I might size my screen down just a little bit so I can get the whole album cover visible. Turn this grid off for now. And then what I end up doing is laying that reference image over the top of what I'm working on. And at that point, it almost becomes an exercise in tracing. I'm literally looking at it directly and I'm just playing around with these values over here until I get it sized and working just the way I want. It's almost akin to the idea of taking a transparency and projecting it up on a wall when you've got to work on a big piece of artwork or something like that. It just gives you a proportional reference point that you can use to get something going fast rather than from scratch looking back and forth and just comparing and trying to get it as close as possible. So once I had all of the columns set up, I needed to take a little bit of time to look at the rows. And you can see where we ultimately ended up. I've got 3 rows right here, which I knew I needed to get this text positioned where I wanted on this vertical axis relative to my image here. And if I open up my rows template, you can see that we've got a value of 3.5 M's at the top. We've got our auto value right here so that this row can respond to the size of the text within. And then finally, we're using a 1.5 M value for this last row. Next, I've got this 0.25 M row that I'm using just to space this text out a tiny little bit. Then I'm using a repeat statement of 2 auto rows to give me my 2 lines of text here. We've got another spacer row of 0.25 M's, and that is this very tiny little line here, which is being used to move this serif font away from the sans serif up here. Another declaration of 2 auto rows, which is how I'm positioning this text here, and then also my monk line here. And then our final row of 1 FR, which is just spacing out the remainder of the album cover. Now here's why I really like to use these grid rows to assign all of these tiny little values like this, like these spacers here. It'd be really easy in a situation like this to perhaps add some top margin to my text here and just push it away from this text. which is fine in this case because, as we talked about earlier, these covers are proportionally responsive. They just keep sizing down as the screen gets smaller. I'm not shifting elements around on a smaller viewport. However, the beauty of the grid spec is being able to really have all of your elements kind of relating to one another with these values. So, for example, if I update this value here, the coordinates I set for all of these elements earlier, like this line of text, my monk line here, and then this genius line, all of those coordinates can stay the same. And then it allows me to come back later and play around with these values and get the spacing just the way I want without having to maybe adjust some margin here, and then changing that might change the margin I applied here, etc. So really lean into these template layouts when you're working with grid because there's so much flexibility it gives you in the long run. And it might take a little bit more setup on the front end, but that back end ease of maintenance is just so worth it in my opinion. All right, so let's turn our grid preview off here, and let's start by talking about the photo here. Now, kind of like our previous example with Blue Train, I ended up finding an image online that was pretty big and clearly an original asset from the recording session. And as the point of this series is kind of exploring creative cropping and filtering and blending, I wanted to use that and see just how close I could get to the original album cover without having to jump into Photoshop or anything like that. Now, if we look at the reference here, we can see that really what's going on is we've got Monk's hand kind of pointing off to this volume 2 line here. And ultimately, the image I found, I think, was cropped a little bit differently. It was pretty short, so I couldn't quite rotate the image enough to get that exactly like the original image without getting some gaps here in my photo. But I figured it was close enough for us to explore this idea. So let's talk about this whole setup here. I've got my photo layer here, which is a cell on my grid. And of course, I've set the coordinates on that grid like we've done in our previous videos. And then, since I knew I was going to be rotating and playing around with that image inside of the cell, I enabled this cell's overflow hidden control. So what this does is it ensures that anything I do to the photo inside this cell, it won't spill out into all of the content around it. So for example, if I turn this off, we can see the result, which is actually pretty cool in and of itself. But for this example, we're trying to match that reference material. Now, very quickly, before we dive into the image element itself, let's look at our effects layer here. And this is the first thing I wanted to chat about, where we're going to talk about stacking our blur layers to kind of get closer to the original reference that we wanted. Now, I actually had a slightly different reference image when I was working on this asset, and it was a little more weathered and faded overall, so that's why this one looks pretty bold in comparison to our example in the browser here. But I really wanted to try and get that weathering as close as possible in the browser. And for that original cover, this image here was pretty washed out, pretty blurry, pretty faded. So the first thing I did was I jumped up to my photo layer here, which again is the cell that we're working on. And if I open this up and just bump up this value a little bit, watch what happens. Notice how when we apply a blur to something, it actually ends up kind of making the edges of that asset really fuzzy, which is of course understandable because of the nature of using this blur effect. So I needed two things here. I needed my original image to get a little more blurry than I could do on the cell layer here, but I also wanted to get a little bit of that kind of ink bleed effect that we've talked about in our previous videos. So what I ended up doing was stacking my blur layers. So if I put this back to the original value here, you can see if I close this out and actually zoom in on my image here, we've got that slightly fuzzy edge from the blur value that we just set on that cell. And then real quickly, if I click on this image and go to its effects layer, you'll see that it has just a little bit more blur on it. And if I take that away, things get a little sharper. And it was a little too sharp for the original reference image I was working on. But putting that whole value on the cell itself just really kind of lost all definition in the outer edges of that element. So using two different blur values at different layers of my image allowed me to get just the right amount of ink bleed that I needed on this cropped cell as a whole, and then also continue to kind of fade things out in here and get me the texture that I wanted internally. All right, so real quick, let's jump back up to our photo cell, go to effects, and we'll see that for our blend mode, we're using hard light. And again, this was kind of me just experimenting with what I wanted to do to get as close as I could to that original asset. And you can see if I place this back on normal, of course, we don't get the interaction with the colors and the texture behind that image that we want as we do when we're using the appropriate blend mode here. So now if I jump into the image here and go to its effects layer, again, you can see that we're blurring things out like we talked about before. And then we also added a bit of contrast and brightness alteration to really bring that image in to the range that we wanted to work with for the final asset. Finally, you'll remember that we added the overflow hidden control on our cell, and that's what allows these transforms that we applied directly to the image to work so well. So if I take these values out, you'll see that's the original full width, full height image just spanning the dimensions of that cell. But applying these transforms allows us to get just a little bit closer to that original album artwork. And really on the image itself, there's nothing too crazy for the controls. We've just set its width and height to 100% since it's in that cell and can work like that. And then we're ensuring that we always get a really nice fit with the image using cover as our object fit value. All right, so next we've got our photo side note here, which is again just a cell we've put on the grid. And since I'm using two different text elements in here to get the result that I was after, I ended up putting my base font size on the cell itself so that I could just set each of those text elements to 1M and then proportionally size this from one spot. Again, that makes my work just a whole lot easier down the road. All these little moves can really save a lot of time as you work through these projects. We've got the internal flexbox layout turned on for that cell. It's in a row setup, and then we're aligning everything to the start of that row and then vertically centering it. So once I had all of this set up and I was aligning it to the start, that's what allowed me to jump back up here and then play around with this value to see if something felt too big, maybe it's running off the edge of the screen, or maybe it's too small in comparison to our reference. And again, it's really just a matter of kind of playing around with these values and getting that feel just right. Now for the second line here, there's really nothing too crazy. I've got my serif font that I ended up picking out, which I believe was Libre Baskerville. And we've done a little bit of negative letter spacing to kind of match what's going on here with the reference image. And as far as static transforms, I don't believe, there's nothing going on there, but we'll talk about this in just a moment. Now, for our first line of text here, you'll see that we're using our monk serif, which again, Libre Baskerville. It's got a slightly different negative letter spacing going on, but for this effect module, you'll see that we're once again using our horizontal scaling technique to get this matching the reference image just the way we want. So again, all I'm really doing here is looking at this and just taking note that these figures ultimately appeared to be just a little bit skinnier than the original here if I take this off. And you'll also see too that since I'm scaling this down, I ended up using the bold version of the font because once I scaled it down horizontally, the stroke ultimately ended up matching the original and the italic version here just a little bit better. Since we're scaling this down horizontally, we're making sure that we're using our left transform origin so that it's not growing out to both sides, it's only shrinking it from the right. And then another one of those minute details just from kind of looking at the reference, but things appeared to be double spaced here, which was kind of a way of setting type back in the day, and some people still do it. But you really don't see it on the web. And in fact, by default, you can't even really do a double space in your content because the browser will just end up ignoring that second space. So the only way I could ultimately accomplish this was using our non-breaking space HTML entity here. So for reference, you can see if I take both of these out, and if I just add one space, that's our one space value. And if I add a second space, you'll notice that nothing has changed because again, the browser is just kind of ignoring that second bit of white space. So if we're really trying to get super nitpicky here and match that original reference just right, we've got to use those two HTML entities to get the spacing there the way we want. I did a similar thing on the second line of text here. And then for the space between the two words, I think I just did a little bit of negative right margin here. Now, this was needed again because I'm kind of playing around with these things that you don't typically do with typography. But since I'm scaling that word in horizontally to the left, ultimately that word is actually ending somewhere around here, but the transform is just visually scaling it to the left. So this right negative margin here is what kind of pulls that text in just a little bit to get it to match the reference there. And then finally, I've got a bit of left margin here, just spacing it out from our image. Really quickly, if I jump down to this little bit of text, you'll see pretty much the same thing here. We've got a matching letter spacing, and then going to effects, we've got a little bit of a scale originating from the left, and then we've got some filtering going on, which again, we'll talk about in just a moment here. So moving on to the sans serif here, I spent a bit of time kind of looking at the font, and there was actually a while where I was looking for something on Google Fonts that kind of had these cut off bottom edges on characters like the O or the S. But after a couple minutes of really looking at them, I noticed that this cutoff look wasn't even. For example, if you look at this O here, you can see it's slightly more cut off at the top than it is at the bottom here, versus this O, which appears to be way more lopped off at the bottom than our other O down here. So this kind of made me think that, okay, maybe the original intent was to find a font and then cut off these edges, so we ultimately end up getting this real clean kind of transition from each word to the next without any white space in between. And I think that's kind of what's going on here. And you'll see there's also some careful placement of our lines here where the U is lining right up here with our H's negative space, and also in between the H and the E. And then you'll notice that like the top part of our M here is lining up with the bottom of the U. Just all these little things that you probably don't notice right off the bat, but they're kind of subconsciously making this very abstract form have some structure to it. So what I ultimately ended up doing was choosing, I believe, Roboto Condensed on Google Fonts because, again, in just kind of looking at the forms, it felt the closest to the original to me. And you can see if I click on my text here and go to my effects, we're doing our scaling again. So the original is actually still a little bit too wide when compared to the reference image. So if I put back in that scaling value, we've now got a much closer approximation to the original there. Now, how I handled the tops and bottoms of these letters getting cut off was, if I jump down to my line height here, you'll see that I've kind of zeroed it out as much as possible to get it really wrapping those letters. Next, on the cell surrounding my word, I went to its overflow hidden control and I enabled it. So you'll see that if I turn this off, we actually get the tops and bottoms of those O's and things coming back, but then turning it back on gives me that slightly lopped off look. And again, this was really an example of taking that kind of overlay approach and just eyeballing it, kind of getting a sense of the proportional relationship between everything. But you'll see what I did is I put the font size on this cell itself because I knew that I wanted to use relative values all the way down the chain to get this working just right. So I ultimately used this to kind of get the overall height that I wanted. And then to actually get things cut off, I've set this 0.7 M value here on the cell's height to clip those letters just a little bit. So it's really this kind of careful interplay of setting up a base value that gets you that sizing you want, and then having everything down the chain really work in your favor. And that's pretty much the technique I used on all of these. So if I click on this cell, for example, you'll see the exact same value set up. And that's what's kind of nice, is once I got one set up, I could basically just copy those values and I was good to go. Now again, I tried with the spacing and the scaling to kind of get the figures matching as much as I could. It wasn't perfect, but we pretty much got in the ballpark there, so I'm pretty happy with it. As for the horizontal spacing to the left here, you'll see if I click on my text layer that I've just got a bit of left spacing here, and that's what's moving this word away from the left edge. And actually, even with all of the base font size and height and line height setup that you saw earlier on the word, I still needed a little bit of negative bottom margin to move that word where I wanted it to go. You'll see it's pretty lopped off at the top here, but not so much at the bottom. So this tiny little adjustment just kind of brought it down and got it a little bit more closer to where I wanted it to be. All right, so now let's talk about some real low-level color grading type stuff and how we get our digital ink, so to speak, to match between our photograph layer here and also the text that we're using throughout this piece. Because obviously, if we were thinking of this as a physical medium, the same color of black ink that's being used to print this image onto the album artwork is also being used to print these words. And of course, they're being applied to the same red background, so we kind of need to get the same interaction that's happening with the background layer and our photo to be happening with our text. And there's a really simple trick to get this working. We're going to look back at our reference and open this up in something like Photoshop, where we can get a color sample of the image that we're working with. And effectively, we want to find the part of the image that is darkest and grab a little sample there and then use that color for our text. And then we're later going to filter it and apply some similar blending to what we did with this photograph to get it all to match in a very even, uniform fashion. So basically, I did just that. I took the reference image here that we talked about earlier, and I basically opened that up in Photoshop, found the darkest part of the photo for me to sample something from, and that ultimately gave me a value that I was using on my text layers here, these ones that are black. And you can see if I open this up, it's not a pure black, but it's pretty darn close. Now, as I just mentioned, the trick to getting this all working comes with the filtering and the blending and making sure that we're just keeping things uniform throughout our piece. So if we click back onto our photo here and jump up to the photo layer, which is our grid cell, you'll remember that we used this hard light blend mode. And then if I click on to the image itself within that cell, you'll remember our bit of filtering from earlier where we've got some contrast and brightness going on here. That's just being used to get our image a little bit closer to what was my original reference piece. So kind of keep those values in mind. We've got that hard light blend mode, along with this 55% contrast and 77% brightness, which I'm going to take and then apply to my text layers to get them matching. So let's, for example, click on this cell right here. And if I jump to its effects layer, you'll see that we've got the hard light blend mode turned on. And remember, we've got this on our cell because it needs to be the direct child of the element with the background we want to interact with. And since our text is inside the cell, if we were to apply this blend mode on that layer, nothing would appear to be happening. And you can see if I jump down here and turn this back to normal, this is the result we get because we also have our contrast and our brightness applied here. So if I take that off, you'll see that we've got that very dark black that we sampled from our image earlier, but of course it doesn't match at all. So if we start from the blend mode this time and go back to our hard light, not a whole lot happening as of yet, but once I jump back up here and then apply our filters back, that's how we really start to get the colors within this text to match our image and really start feeling like a cohesive whole. And that's pretty much the trick that I use throughout. If I click on this piece here, for example, then I go down to my effects layer, you'll see that we've got the hard light blend mode set here, but I didn't do any filtering on this layer. And that's because I was kind of playing around with the idea of using individual filters on different bits of text to maybe do a slightly different blur or contrast or brightness value. And you could explore this, doing subtle little changes to get just a little bit of wear and tear in a particular section of the page that you're not using elsewhere. Now, ultimately, I pretty much ended up using that 55% value for my contrast and 77% value for my brightness all throughout the piece. But I did experiment with that a little bit. I did kind of break it up and just see what I got. And I challenge you guys to kind of take these ideas, these concepts, and run with them in your own designs. See what you like and just keep these little tricks in the back of your mind. You know, put them in your web designer's tool belt and keep them around for a situation where it becomes appropriate. But this design in particular was one where I explored slightly different blur values throughout. So for example, if I click on this text, looks like it's the same there, but if I go down here, and actually this would have been on my cell here, you'll see that we're using a slightly larger blur value. And again, this is just a matter of experimenting, kind of giving the page a little bit more of an organic feel as you move through it. Now, similar to the image up here, a quick note on this text and using blur on the cell, that was because you'll remember on this cell layer, we're using that overflow hidden trick to get the tops and bottoms of our letters cut off here. And if I were to apply this blur filter to the text inside that cell, what you would get is these blurry edges on the sides of the letters here, but any part that was being cut off by this cell here would have a really super straight, clean edge. And it's just one of those nuances of working with blur. It's not blurring the whole visible element cleanly, it's blurring the element itself. So if you're using an overflow hidden trick like this, it's just something that you want to be aware of. Now, the final piece to talk about here is kind of this background layer on my artwork. And you'll kind of notice that there's a little bit of color gradation going on throughout this piece. It's not a perfect solid red, kind of like our reference pieces here. And again, that's because the original reference I was using was a little more tattered and torn and kind of weathered. So what I actually did with that was I took that original reference into Photoshop, and then I used my content-aware fill to basically intelligently delete bits of the album artwork one little piece at a time. And ultimately, what I was left with was this kind of very worn and torn album cover that had some lighter spots in some areas, some darker spots in other areas. It just gave, again, a little bit more of an organic feel. And as we've talked about in this series, it's really all about these little tiny details all stacking up to give the final impression of a finished piece of work. So if we jump back to the builder, you'll see that we're using our advanced backgrounds here for that. And I've got that photo layer, which you can see here. If I move my mouse off, you'll see just those tiny little bits of color changes that are happening throughout that image there. And if I turn this off, you'll see it go back to my pure red layer there. Now, another thing I did is also layer a color on top of my background image here to just get it a little bit more close to this final reference image that I was using here. So I kind of ended up doing a blending of these two. But you'll see if I take this color layer here and go back to transparent, you can see a lot more of that weathering coming through, but the slightly transparent red here allows for just a bit of that to shine through, but I'm getting a slightly more uniform appearance due to this color being on top of everything.